Drugs. Another name for drugs is poison. Almost all drugs act by poisoning some other function of the body in order to achieve an effect. This includes recreational drugs, alcohol, and medications. And most drugs impact liver detoxification systems, the CYP enzymes, in a way that prove they are poisons. In this chapter, we are going to learn neurochemical pathways, some theories on how drugs may work, and nutritive ways to assist deficiencies and withdrawal. The synapse. How nerve transmission occurs is in the following way. The originating nerve talks to the receptive nerve across the synapse. The synapses are breaks in the chain of nerves where chemicals can flow from one neuron to another. Chemically, there is an opportunity to either increase or decrease the intensity of the nerve impulse at the synapse. Some chemicals inhibit the intensity of a nerve impulse, and some stimulate the impulse to be of greater intensity. The neurotransmitters are chemicals which are stored here in the originating nerve in an area called the vesicles. A nerve transmission comes down the nerve and can cause a release of the neurotransmitter from these vesicles. The neurotransmitter flows across the synapse. The receptors on the other side of the synapse are activated by the neurotransmitter and then transmit that information to the next neuron. After the neurotransmitter activates the receptors, it is recycled back into the vesicles to be used again. This recycling process is very important to the sustainability of the neurochemicals, and without recycling, the vesicles would become empty. Serotonin-melatonin pathway. Serotonin is manufactured from the base amino acid tryptophan. Tryptophan is allowed to cross the blood-brain barrier and then convert into 5-HTP. 5-HTP is then converted into serotonin, and then serotonin can be further converted into melatonin. Usually, when a person is trying to naturally boost serotonin, they take either tryptophan or 5-HTP to do so. Niacin is also helpful to assist in this pathway, as tryptophan and 5-HTP can degrade into niacin if the person does not have enough niacin in the first place. Serotonin is popularized as the body's natural antidepressant, kind of what gives you a lift. Serotonin is better framed as an anti-rumination neurochemical. People who are low serotonin typically present as anxious, impulsive, and obsessively ruminating. And since serotonin is the precursor to melatonin, they also tend to have a lack of sleep. Serotonin modifies the impulsive reactionary thoughts of the brainstem and amygdala. The brainstem has a similar capacity to that of a reptile brain. Reptiles act in ways that would be viewed as kill, devour, and rape. Serotonin assists in modifying those impulsive processes to diplomacy, savoring food, and courting. So instead of killing that person who thinks differently than us, our reasoning ability, with the help of serotonin, modifies this to diplomacy and figuring out how that person is different from us and possibly seeking an overlap of agreement. Rather than devour that chocolate cake, we may savor it a bit as we share it with a friend. And rather than forced copulation, we may instead contact a person we are interested in through Facebook. Sugar, and particularly alcohol, are toxic to serotonin metabolism. You may notice that people who consume lots of sugar or alcohol tend to be impulsive. Coffee and caffeine trigger a dump of sugar stored in the liver, which has the same effect. Sugar, alcohol, and low-quality carbohydrates and caffeine are a setup for serotonin deficiency. A study was done in California prisons by Stephen Schoenthaler with the help of then-Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger regarding sugar. It was found that restricting sugar significantly decreased incidences of violence. Melatonin, which is our sleep neurohormone, is created from serotonin inside the brain. You cannot take melatonin and have it cross the blood-brain barrier and get the melatonin into the brain. The melatonin has to be broken down into tryptophan and then build itself back up to melatonin inside the brain. If a person takes melatonin and gets some benefit, this is a good sign. It means the pathway is at least functioning somewhat. If not, then it is very possible that some toxic impairment is occurring, and it likely will have to be addressed. This pathway is subject to toxic impairment from mercury, which we have discussed in previous videos on the above asset. When a pathway is blocked, taking supplements is generally less than effective. There are also genetic factors that can increase or decrease serotonin-melatonin production, which can be assisted with supplementation. Also, exposure to a chronic, stressful environment will deplete serotonin. Stressors that can affect serotonin can also be any type of chronic pain situation like fibromyalgia. Serotonin-melatonin issues present as classic tell signs are ruminating thoughts, impulsivity, and insomnia. Other associated things that may have other causes are carb and sugar cravings and anxiety. To address serotonin and melatonin issues, supplement with 100 to 500 milligrams of niacin, 500 to 1500 milligrams of tryptophan twice a day, and possibly 3 to 6 milligrams of melatonin at night. Toxic impairment. Address any toxic burden, specifically mercury amalgams in teeth. Diet. High protein foods, eliminate sugar, alcohol, and simple carbs. Environment. Decrease exposure to stress. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Serotonin is an inhibitory neurochemical. It lessens the intensity of a nerve impulse. It helps us dampen thoughts, which without this dampening may become compulsions. It can also dampen pain impulses, which is not its primary function, but may explain why certain antidepressant meds are used for such things like fibromyalgia. Inhibitory neurochemicals sort of have the ability to overlap each other and perform similar functions. When a person is deficient in one inhibitory neurochemical, they are typically deficient in all of them, as the other ones have likely been used up trying to compensate. These type of folks lack the ability to turn an intense impulse into a milder one. When serotonin is called upon, it comes out from the vesicles. It is released into the synapse, exerts an inhibition of the nerve impulse. It is then broken down by the serotoninase enzyme so that it can be reuptaken back into the vesicles so it can be used again later. Selective serotonin reuptake type antidepressants, which we will refer to as SSRIs, are generally not what you might regard as a mood elevator. They are more implicated in reducing the probability of someone following through on suicidal ideation. Increasing serotonin may reduce the impulsivity associated with hurting oneself or others. SSRIs could be that magic that gives someone a break from certain symptoms like impulsivity, anxiety, and sleep issues. Unfortunately, like most medications, the effect may not be sustainable, as they are not feeding the nervous system more neurotransmitters, they are spending them. And when the nervous system is completely spent, the problem could become substantially worse. SSRIs have been known to increase suicidality, which is what generated public outcry, forcing manufacturers to include a black box warning. SSRIs are thought to work by poisoning the serotoninase enzyme. The serotoninase enzyme is what allows the serotonin to be recycled. This forces the serotonin to stay in the synapse and continue to exert an inhibitory effect. If the serotonin is not reuptaken, as it should be, over time it is probable that it then breaks down into its metabolites to the point where there is no serotonin left and the vesicles are exhausted. And when there is no serotonin left to reuptake, then a reuptake inhibitor, in theory, would be useless. Tryptophan is the serotonin precursor. We use it in conjunction with an SSRI withdrawal. The use of both an antidepressant and tryptophan is meant only for someone who is actively reducing the antidepressant. The sustained combination of both could produce a rare but potentially fatal disorder called serotonin syndrome. For that reason, unless you are actively tapering your SSRI, do not use both in combination. For withdrawal, it is helpful to build up serotonin as the medication withdrawal is occurring to lessen the withdrawal side effects. One possible symptom of antidepressant withdrawal is brain zaps. These feel like electrical discharges in the head and sometimes the body. The recommendation for someone experiencing these is to slow the withdrawal and work on building up serotonin reserves, and then going slower. Brain zaps are said to not be damaging, but they are certainly not a good sign either. Serotonin, norepinephrine, reuptake inhibitors. These medications, in theory, reuptake not only serotonin, but norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is an excitatory neurochemical that is closely associated with dopamine. Dopamine and norepinephrine are more aligned with what one thinks of mood elevation and antidepressants. Norepinephrine flows into the synapse and increases the intensity of a nerve impulse. It is then reuptaken naturally to be used again. Norepinephrine is associated with memory and the ability to focus on a task. Low epinephrine could result in a lethargic depression, an inability to find reward in life, attention problems, and a difficult time focusing on such tasks like reading and comprehension. Excessive norepinephrine most often presents as anxiety. We will discuss more about norepinephrine when we talk about dopamine. SNRIs then are meant to increase the availability of serotonin and norepinephrine. And so theoretically, they would lower someone's impulsivity and help stimulate them out of depression. That actually sounds kind of wonderful. Unfortunately, this intended effect, again, for reasons mentioned earlier, may not be sustainable. Also, for someone that is anxious, an SNRI can markedly increase that anxiety. Antidepressants have varying half-lives, with Effexor being the shortest at less than 1 day, and Prozac at the longest at possibly 5 or more days. The height of withdrawal tends to hit right after the half-life. Antidepressants with a shorter half-life generally are more problematic if someone were to cold turkey, as they may leave the system faster than the person can adjust. On the average, a person can expect withdrawal manifestations from an antidepressant to occur 24 hours to 5 days after the taper, and in general, days 2 to 3. Once someone surmounts their first taper, whatever pattern of symptoms they had, and the timing and onset of those symptoms, and then relief, will be similar to what they can expect on each taper. This withdrawal pattern is consistent for all medications, with the special exception being antipsychotics, which we will explain in detail later. dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. The dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine pathway is also called the catecholamine pathway. The amino acid precursors to this pathway are DLPA and tyrosine. Using DLPA is a bit of a softer precursor, where tyrosine is more direct. Dopamine is the primary neurochemical of reward. It is what helps us seek a job well done, a rewarding intimate relationship, and creative thought. Too little dopamine would have a person feel flat and lethargic, with little perception of life's rewards. Too much dopamine may make a person feel manic. Norepinephrine is what allows us to focus and to learn. Too little means a poor attention span, and too much means anxiety. Stimulants' effect on dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Persons with too low of a perception of reward or inability to focus may have an addictive biochemistry that craves stimulants. Stimulants include amphetamines, cocaine, coffee, and sugar, ADHD medications, and on some level, SNRIs, like Effexor, Wellbutrin, and Cymbalta. These stimulants are generally not sustainable in their action. For instance, cocaine certainly increases a person's perception of reward to the point where everything becomes rewarding. But after continued use, there is no amount of cocaine, money, fast cars, or the reward of sex that can produce the same feeling. Here is how that works. Normally, when dopamine is released, it takes something that we have associated reward with and amplifies its attractiveness. So it increases stimulation around that object or feeling. After the stimulus has been transmitted, the dopamine transport system breaks down the dopamine from the synapse and delivers it back to the vesicles so that it can be used again. This recycling process is normal. Genetically, and even behavioral conditioning or trauma can alter the way all this works. Some people produce more dopamine. Some people break it down differently. Some people find reward in the smallest things. And some people eclipse their desire with fear. When you introduce a stimulant at the synapse, it blocks the dopamine transport system, which is the reuptake mechanism for dopamine. The dopamine stays in the synapse and continues to exert a stimulating response. And that certainly feels rewarding for a while. As with serotonin, when the dopamine is forced to stay out in the synapse, it degrades into its metabolites. Then, there is no dopamine left for the stimulant to use, and the stimulant becomes ineffective. Additionally, there is another mechanism called downregulation. Downregulation is where the receptors become less responsive and it takes more and more of the drug to exert an effect. And so in the case of dopamine, the dopamine receptors become dampened in their ability to transmit the perception of reward. The logical fix is to feed the nervous system what it needs, not spend what it doesn't have. To address stimulant withdrawal issues, supplement with 500 to 1500 milligrams of tyrosine or if mild anxiety is present, then begin with 500 to 1500 milligrams of DLPA. Add 50 milligrams of B6. If extreme anxiety exists, wait until the anxiety passes before using these methods. Do not ever use this supplement regimen during an antipsychotic or benzo withdrawal. Toxic impairment. Check for thyroid issues. Stop smoking. Diet. Eliminate sugar and caffeine. Pay special attention to removing allergen foods. Environment. Increase physical activity. Meditation practices. Work on being okay with being in the down. Typically, ADHD medications or recreational stimulant withdrawal can be done abruptly. Occasionally, if extreme depression is a prominent feature for someone using ADHD medications, then tapering is appropriate. Antipsychotic effect on dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. Antipsychotic medications often work by holding back dopamine. Remember, too much dopamine can result in mania. Blocking dopamine with an antipsychotic is an all too effective way to bring someone out of mania and psychosis. But it also limits the person's ability to access the normal perception of reward. This is what an antipsychotic looks like at the synapse. Dopamine is normally released from the vesicles into the synapse and affects the receptors so as to produce stimulation. In the presence of an antipsychotic, less dopamine is able to reach the receptors, and so therefore very little stimulation is happening, and so the perception of reward is muted. And now we get to a concept very like downregulation, as we saw with stimulants. But in this case, what happens is upregulation. The tendency for the nervous system to up or downregulate is collectively called neuroplasticity. In the case of antipsychotics, what tends to happen is that the dopamine receptors upregulate. So in effect, the synapse builds more dopamine receptors. In this way, the little bit of dopamine that gets through has a higher chance of exciting something. And so in this way, the drugs tend to become less effective, and the person needs more and more of the drug to combat the original symptoms. With this upregulation happening in the synapse, getting off of an antipsychotic can be very difficult and needs to be handled with extra caution. Even if the person was misdiagnosed, they can still have a challenging time getting off of these drugs. This is why. What do you think will happen when you start reducing the drug? When you start getting a more normal amount of dopamine hitting an excessive number of dopamine receptors? Right, you will often get a rather sudden escalation of mania or psychosis. Oftentimes, when this happens, conventionally we think, well, of course. Look at what happens when they come off the drug. They need this drug. And the person becomes their diagnosis forever. Most likely what is happening is that the nervous system just needs time to re-regulate itself, and that if the person goes slow enough, they can adapt. A person coming off of antipsychotics too fast often reports a lack of sleep, failure to eat, and act tangentially. This can be tough because once a person gets into these states, they may be resistant to slowing things down and you may lose them. This is largely what makes this the most difficult drug class to withdraw from. To address antipsychotic medication withdrawal issues, supplement with niacin 1,000 to 5,000 milligrams daily. Always include approximately twice as much vitamin C as niacin. Use BH4 and phosphatidylserine to convert the dopamine. Toxic impairment. Stop smoking if possible, but at least limit it. Sudden onset of chain smoking is not a good sign and can mean the person is starting to spin out. Do not smoke pot or do any recreational drugs, especially stimulants or hallucinogens, at this time. Eliminate sugar and caffeine. Seriously, even a cup of coffee during the withdrawal can land a person in the hospital. What was tolerated before on meds, as far as stimulants, almost certainly cannot be tolerated during the withdrawal. Understand this well. What habits a person may have had on antipsychotics are not going to serve them while coming off. Eat protein-based foods and eat 3 times per day. The proteins help ground a person and control blood sugar swings at this time. Vegans and vegetarians may have a bit of a rough go at this. If vegan, include as heavy of vegan proteins as you can and limit light foods like fruits. Environment. Increase physical activity, specifically cardiovascular. Gym membership, regular yoga classes. They are going to need to redirect all of that energy. If a person is still lethargic from the drugs, start with walking and then move up to something more demanding. Do anything to extrovert the attention out into the world. Hikes, manual labor. It is best to limit reading, especially religious material, just during this time. The concepts of God and religion during an antipsychotic withdrawal can fuel psychosis. Even limiting meditation practices during this time is advised. The idea is to get out of the head and externalize as much into the environment as possible, including getting off of the phone and off of the computer. Additionally, allow 1 month of withdrawal for every 1 year on an antipsychotic medication if psychosis was a feature. This general rule is specific to long-term users of antipsychotics that have psychosis as a feature. If this is the case, the suggestion is to withdraw as much as is practical during the stay at ATMC and to get to the lowest possible dose. Then continue at that lowest possible dose for a period of time at home, from 3 months to a year, to make sure life's feelings are getting integrated. Consider Depakote as a buffer. Depakote can help soften the withdrawal. Depakote can be used throughout the duration of the antipsychotic withdrawal. Once the antipsychotic withdrawal is over, the Depakote withdrawal is almost certainly much easier comparatively. If an antipsychotic was introduced to help with sleep or for a reason other than psychosis and is at a low dose, then a person can generally come off faster without the use of Depakote.